Felicia Orner is suffocating inside a $50,000 gown at the most dangerous gala in Chicago, surrounded by people who wouldn't notice if she passed out. While she tries to keep her image flawless, she's literally running out of air. Until a powerful stranger behind her murmurs, "Your zipper's stuck. Too tight." Felicia Orner stands alone at the Graham Syndicate's elite annual gala, pretending to belong among the ruthless Chicago social power circle. Her designer gown becomes so tight she can barely breathe, but she forces herself to stay poised because her reputation, and her mission, depends on appearing unshakable. As she struggles for air, no one seems to notice that she's actually in physical distress. Felicia's fingers worked frantically at the zipper, her movements masked by the gentle sway of her body as she pretended to admire a nearby sculpture. The crowd pressed closer around the art installation, guests leaning in with wine glasses raised, their conversations a perfect cover for her desperate attempts. She tugged at the metal teeth with the delicacy of a surgeon, praying the fabric wouldn't tear, praying no one would notice the subtle jerking motions of her shoulders. But they did notice. A woman in pearls glanced sideways, her gaze lingering on Felicia's back with the kind of knowing look that made Felicia's stomach drop. Two men in navy suits exchanged whispers, their eyes following the line of exposed skin that the malfunctioning dress revealed. A server paused mid-stride, tray balanced perfectly while his attention fixed on her predicament with undisguised curiosity. The weight of their collective observation pressed against her like humidity. Felicia could feel their stares cataloging every detail, the way her dress gaped, the flush creeping up her neck, the tremor in her hands as she fought with the zipper. She was performing her humiliation for an audience she hadn't invited, each failed attempt at the zipper becoming a small spectacle. The sculpture before her blurred as panic crept in. She needed to move, to find a bathroom, a quiet corner, anywhere but here under the watchful eyes of strangers. But as she prepared to excuse herself from the crowd, a shift in the room's energy made her pause. Someone was moving through the gathering with purpose that cut through the evening's leisurely rhythm. Not the random drift of cocktail party navigation, but the focused approach of a predator who had spotted prey. Felicia didn't turn to look. Some instinct older than thought warned her against sudden movements. Instead, she caught glimpses in her peripheral vision, the parting of guests who stepped aside without quite knowing why, the subtle displacement of bodies creating a path. Whoever approached moved with the kind of fluid grace that spoke of absolute confidence, each step deliberate and unhurried. The conversations around her continued, but she could sense the approach like a change in atmospheric pressure. Her fingers stilled on the zipper. The pearled woman's gaze shifted beyond Felicia now, drawn to the figure cutting through the crowd. The men in navy suits straightened almost imperceptibly. Darryl Graham materialized in her peripheral vision like smoke given form, his presence both elegant and dangerous. He moved as if the crowded room were empty space, as if the other guests were merely obstacles that rearranged themselves at his will. His approach carried the weight of inevitability. Felicia's breath caught. She knew, with crystalline certainty, that her evening had just taken a turn towards something far more complicated than a wardrobe malfunction. The pillar materialized behind Felicia as if Darryl had orchestrated the entire room's geometry. She found herself pressed against the cool marble, not by force but by the sheer magnetism of his presence drawing closer while simultaneously cutting off her escape routes. The crowd seemed to ebb away from them naturally, leaving a pocket of intimate space that felt both protective and predatory. Darryl positioned himself with the casual precision of a chess master, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated that probably cost more than her rent. He didn't touch her, but his proximity created an invisible cage. His body angled just so, blocking her view of potential allies while maintaining the appearance of polite conversation to anyone glancing their way. "Felicia Chan," he said, her name rolling off his tongue like he'd been practicing it. The sound sent an unwelcome shiver down her spine. "You're even more striking than your photographs suggested." She tried to step sideways, but the pillar's marble surface offered no give, and Darryl's subtle shift matched her movement perfectly. He was orchestrating this dance without seeming to move at all. "I'm sorry, have we met?" She kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Professional smile, professional tone. Treat him like any other networking contact, despite every instinct screaming danger. Not formally. His smile was warm, inviting, the kind that probably made boardrooms full of executives sign contracts they'd later regret. But I've been following your work. Your investigative pieces have a particular tenacity that's quite admirable. The compliment felt like silk wrapped around a blade. Felicia's fingers found the zipper again, working it with tiny, desperate movements while trying to maintain eye contact. The fabric strained against her breathing, each inhale a small battle against the constricting dress. Daryl's gaze followed the movement with the lazy attention of a cat watching a mouse. His eyes traced the line of her dress, noting the way it pulled across her shoulders, the slight gape where the zipper had given way. When his gaze returned to her face, his smile had deepened into something that made her skin crawl. "Suffocating, isn't it?" he said quietly, and for a moment she thought he meant the dress. Then his meaning crystallized with horrible clarity. When you're trapped in a situation beyond your control. When every move you make only tightens the noose. The words were delivered with the same conversational tone he might use to comment on the weather, but they landed like physical blows. He knew. About the investigation, about how close she'd gotten, about how thoroughly she was now exposed. "I'm not sure what you mean," she managed, though her voice came out thinner than intended. "Of course you don't." His hand moved toward her face, and she flinched, but he only gestured to the air between them, never making contact. "You're wearing stress like perfume tonight, Felicia. It's quite palpable." Her breathing had become shallow, whether from the dress or from fear, she couldn't tell. The distinction felt academic when each breath felt like work. Daryl noticed this too, his gaze dropping to the rise and fall of her constrained chest with clinical interest. "Beautiful dress," he continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper that somehow felt more threatening than if he'd shouted. "Custom tailored, I'd guess. Though it seems to be fighting you rather than flattering you. Sometimes the most beautiful traps are the ones we walk into willingly." The double meaning hung in the air between them like smoke. Felicia's hand stilled on the zipper as the full weight of her situation crashed over her. She wasn't just dealing with a wardrobe malfunction anymore. She was prey, cornered by a predator who had been watching her long enough to know exactly where and how to strike. "What do you want?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Daryl's smile widened, revealing teeth that were perfectly straight and somehow menacing in their perfection. "Just conversation, Felicia. Just a little chat between professionals." Daryl leaned closer, close enough that his breath stirred the hair at her ear. The marble pillar pressed cold against her back as he invaded her personal space with predatory confidence. To anyone watching from across the room, they might appear to be having an intimate conversation between lovers or close business associates. The illusion was perfect, deliberate. "Your zipper's stuck," he whispered, his voice silk over steel. The words caressed her ear with terrifying gentleness. "Too tight." Felicia's blood turned to ice water. The simple observation landed with the force of an accusation, each syllable precisely enunciated to ensure she understood the full weight of his awareness. He wasn't just commenting on her wardrobe malfunction, he was cataloging her vulnerability, her exposure, her complete lack of control over the situation. His pause stretched like a held breath before he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "The mafia boss noticed." The words hit her like a physical blow. Not a mafia boss or if someone noticed. The mafia boss noticed. The definite articles carried the weight of certainty, of intimate knowledge, of a trap that had been closing around her for longer than she'd realized. He wasn't just threatening her, he was confirming that her investigation had led her directly into the web she'd been trying to expose. Felicia's hand flew to her throat in an involuntary gesture, her professional composure cracking like glass under pressure. The question hung unspoken in the charged air between them, "Why are you struggling, and what are you hiding?" But the interrogation lived in his knowing gaze, in the way his eyes tracked every micro-expression that crossed her face. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, the denial automatic even as her voice betrayed the lie with its breathless quality. Her free hand worked frantically at the zipper again, the metal teeth stubborn against her increasingly desperate attempts. The irony wasn't lost on her, trying to escape his observation by engaging in the exact behavior he'd just called out. Daryl's smile never wavered. If anything, it deepened with satisfaction at her obvious panic. He didn't need to press the point. Her reaction had already given him everything he needed. "Of course you don't," he murmured, his tone gentle and terrible. "Though I have to say, denial is a particularly beautiful look on you. Almost as striking as desperation." The compliment felt like a spider crawling across her skin. Felicia pushed away from the pillar with sudden force, her survival instincts finally overriding her paralysis. She needed distance, needed air, needed to be anywhere but trapped in this marble corner with a man who spoke threats like poetry. "Excuse me," she managed, attempting to sidestep around him. "I need to." But Daryl moved with fluid grace, not blocking her path overtly but somehow always positioned to make her route more difficult. Like water flowing around obstacles, he redirected her movement without seeming to try. Each step she took seemed to lead her deeper into his choreography rather than toward freedom. "Running away?" His question followed her movement, casual as a comment about the weather. "How unlike the tenacious investigative journalist I've heard so much about. I thought you were the type to stay and ask the hard questions." Felicia's heels clicked against the polished floor as she forced herself forward, weaving between clusters of guests who seemed oblivious to the predator-prey dynamic playing out in their midst. Her breath came in short gasps, whether from the constricting dress or mounting terror, she couldn't determine. Behind her, she could feel Daryl's presence like heat from a fire, following at a leisurely pace that somehow felt more menacing than pursuit. He wasn't chasing her because he didn't need to. They both knew this was his territory, his event, his rules. The crowd pressed around her, faces blurring together as she searched desperately for an exit, a bathroom, anywhere she could regroup and think. But escape felt like an illusion when every step seemed to be anticipated by the man who moved through the crowd like he owned not just the room, but everyone in it. Daryl's voice followed her retreat like smoke, carrying across the polished marble with an intimacy that made her skin crawl. "Felicia." Her name again, spoken with the same casual ownership that made her steps falter despite every instinct screaming at her to run. She turned, finding him closer than expected, having closed the distance between them with that same predatory grace. His expression had shifted into something that might have passed for concern if not for the calculation behind his eyes. "There's no need for such distress," he said, his voice pitched at exactly the right volume to seem like genuine worry to anyone who might overhear. "I can see you're struggling with something quite binding." The word choice made her stomach clench. Everything about this man felt like a carefully laid trap, each syllable selected for maximum psychological impact. "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice came out strained. The zipper had seized completely now, and she could feel the fabric pulling tighter with each breath. The dress that had felt elegant an hour ago now felt like a straitjacket designed by a sadist. "Of course you are." His smile was warm, paternal almost, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. "But I'm a problem solver by nature. It's what I do." He paused, letting that settle. "Let me help you with that zipper." The offer hung in the air between them like a poisoned gift. Felicia's eyes darted around the room, cataloging exits, searching for allies, finding nothing but oblivious party guests lost in their own conversations and political maneuvering. "That's very kind, but I can manage." "I insist." The words were spoken with the same gentle tone, but something in his inflection made them absolute. Not a request. Not even an offer anymore. A decision that had already been made. Before she could protest further, his hand settled on her shoulder with the weight of inevitability. The touch was gentle, almost fatherly, but it carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His fingers pressed just firmly enough to communicate that resistance would be futile. "You see," he continued conversationally, his hand remaining in place like a brand, "struggling in a crowded room like this would only draw more attention. And I suspect that's the last thing you want right now." Felicia's breath caught as the full implications crashed over her. He was right, and they both knew it. Any scene she made would only expose her further, would turn what was already a nightmare into a public spectacle. The other guests would stare, would whisper, would remember. Her professional reputation would be destroyed along with whatever remained of her dignity. "What do you want?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. "Just to help," he said, and his sincerity was the most frightening thing yet. "Turn around." It wasn't a request. The pressure of his hand increased incrementally, a silent reminder of the consequences of noncompliance. Felicia found herself turning despite every nerve in her body screaming protest, her survival instincts warring with the terrible logic of his position. Her back was to him now, exposed and vulnerable. She could feel his presence behind her like heat from a furnace, could sense his satisfaction even without seeing his face. The crowd continued their conversations around them, oblivious to the power dynamic playing out in their midst. "There," he murmured, his voice close enough to her ear that she could feel his breath on her neck. "Much better. Now, let's see about that troublesome zipper." His fingers found the metal teeth with practiced ease, and Felicia realized with growing horror that this wasn't the first time Daryl Graham had positioned himself behind a trapped woman. The thought made her knees weak, but his hand on her shoulder kept her upright, kept her still, kept her exactly where he wanted her. She had become a willing participant in her own captivity, and they both knew it. Daryl's fingers moved with surgical precision, finding the stubborn zipper mechanism as if he'd memorized every detail of her dress from across the room. His touch was clinical, professional, yet somehow more intimate than any caress. Each movement deliberate, controlled, carrying the authority of someone who had never been told no. The first contact of his skin against hers sent electricity racing down her spine. His fingertips were warm against the exposed skin of her back, the touch feather-light yet claiming ownership with every second of contact. He worked the zipper with the patience of a master craftsman, his long fingers manipulating the metal teeth with an expertise that spoke of practice, of other women, other moments of manufactured vulnerability. "There's the problem," he murmured, his voice so close to her ear that she could feel the vibration in her bones. "Just a small snag. Nothing that can't be worked through." The double meaning in his words made her shiver despite the warmth of his touch. His fingers traced the line of the zipper's track, ostensibly checking for damage, but the movement felt like cartography, like he was mapping territory he intended to claim. Around them, the crowd had begun to notice. Conversations faltered as guests caught sight of the tableau they presented, the powerful man's hands on the trapped woman's back, her rigid posture, the way she held herself like prey frozen before a predator. The shock was palpable, rippling through the nearby clusters of partygoers like a stone thrown into still water. A woman in emerald silk actually gasped, her wine glass pausing halfway to her lips. Two men in expensive suits exchanged glances loaded with meaning, their expressions shifting between envy and fear. They recognized Daryl, understood his reputation, and were witnessing something that felt both scandalous and terrifyingly significant. But no one moved to intervene. That was Daryl's true power, not just his willingness to exercise control, but the way others instinctively understood that crossing him carried consequences too steep to contemplate. The crowd watched with the fascination of witnesses to a car accident, unable to look away yet powerless to stop what was unfolding. Felicia felt their stares like physical weight, each gaze adding another layer to her humiliation. She was trapped not just by Daryl's hands and proximity, but by the performance he was orchestrating. Moving would create a scene. Protesting would draw more attention. Standing still meant accepting whatever he chose to do. His fingers found the precise point where the fabric had caught, working the delicate material free with movements that were somehow both gentle and possessive. Each adjustment required him to press closer, his chest nearly touching her back, his breath stirring the fine hairs at her nape. "Almost there," he whispered, and she couldn't tell if he meant the zipper or something far more sinister. The metal teeth began to move under his manipulation, sliding with reluctant cooperation. But instead of relief, Felicia felt mounting dread. This wasn't rescue, it was demonstration. He was showing everyone in the room, herself included, exactly how easily he could control her, how completely he could manage her most private struggles. His touch lingered longer than necessary, fingers trailing against her skin as the zipper finally yielded to his ministrations. The sensation was electric, unwelcome, and utterly inescapable. She was immobilized not by force but by the social contract he had created, the unspoken agreement that she would accept his help and be grateful for it. "There," he said finally, his satisfaction audible in the single word. His hands remained on her shoulders, a gentle weight that felt like shackles. All better. But nothing was better. If anything, everything was infinitely worse. The crowd was still watching, still cataloging every detail of her surrender. Daryl was still behind her, still close enough that she could feel his presence like heat from a fire. And she was still trapped, perhaps more thoroughly than she had been with the broken zipper. Because now she owed him, and they both knew that debts to men like Daryl Graham were never repaid on the debtor's terms. The zipper yielded another precious inch, and Felicia drew her first full breath in what felt like hours. The relief was immediate, almost overwhelming, air flooding her lungs, the constricting fabric finally giving way under Daryl's expert manipulation. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe this nightmare might simply end with a working zipper and mutual pretense that nothing had happened. Then his lips found her ear again. "Much better," he murmured, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had just proven a point. The zipper continued its reluctant descent under his fingers, each millimeter of freedom accompanied by his increasingly intimate whispers. "Breathing is such a basic necessity, don't you think? Amazing how we take it for granted until it's restricted." Felicia's moment of relief curdled into renewed dread. She could hear the transaction coming in his tone, the way his words carried the weight of conditions yet to be revealed. "Now then," he continued, his fingers still working the zipper with maddening slowness, "favors like this don't come free. I'm sure you understand." The crowd around them remained frozen in their voyeuristic fascination, but Felicia barely registered their stares anymore. All her attention focused on the man behind her, on the price he was about to extract for the simple act of letting her breathe. "What do you want?" The words escaped as barely more than breath. His chuckle was warm, almost affectionate, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Such a direct question from an investigative journalist. "I appreciate that quality in you, Felicia. It's why we're going to work so well together." The zipper dropped another inch, offering more relief that felt increasingly like a drug being metered out by a careful dealer. "Tell me who hired you," he said, the words delivered with casual precision. Each syllable was perfectly weighted, the question posed as if he were asking about the weather rather than demanding information that could destroy lives. "The real client behind your little investigation into my business interests." Felicia's blood turned to ice water. He wasn't just aware of her work, he knew it was commissioned, knew someone had paid her to dig into his operations. The depth of his knowledge made her feel naked in ways that had nothing to do with her malfunctioning dress. "I don't know what." Or, he interrupted smoothly, his fingers pausing on the zipper, letting the thread of its return to its stuck position hang in the air, "You could stay with me tonight." Simple conversation, really. Get to know each other better. The alternative hung between them like poison. Both options were traps, both would destroy her in different ways. Give up her source and betray everything she stood for professionally, or submit to whatever Daryl Graham considered conversation with a trapped woman. "Choose carefully," he whispered, his breath warm against her neck. "Because the zipper can always get stuck again." The zipper hung loose now, offering the breathing room Felicia had desperately craved, but the relief felt hollow, poisoned by understanding. She could inhale fully, could move without the fabric cutting into her skin, yet she had never felt more constrained. The physical freedom was an illusion masking a far more insidious imprisonment. Daryl's hands remained on her shoulders, no longer working the zipper but maintaining contact like a brand of ownership. His touch had transformed the elegant white gown into something tainted, marked by his possession. She could feel the contamination spreading through the fabric, through her skin, into her very bones. What had been pristine was now compromised, and they both knew it could never be clean again. "There," he said softly, his satisfaction evident in the single word. "Much better, don't you think?" But nothing was better. The help he'd offered had been the opening move in a much larger game, and she'd walked directly into it. Every second of his assistance had been calculated, every gentle touch a thread in the web he was weaving around her. She had accepted his aid, and in doing so, had accepted the transaction that came with it. The crowd around them began to disperse, the immediate spectacle concluded, but their whispered conversations carried the weight of witnessed intimacy. They had seen Daryl Graham's hands on her, had watched her submit to his touch, had catalogued her surrender for future reference. In their eyes, she was already his. "The choice is still yours," he murmured, though they both understood it was no choice at all. "But choose quickly." Indecision is such an unattractive quality. Felicia closed her eyes, feeling the walls of her new reality closing in around her. The investigation that had brought her here, the source she was meant to protect, the professional integrity she'd built over years of careful work, all of it balanced against whatever Daryl Graham meant by staying with him tonight. The white gown that had made her feel powerful and confident now felt like a wedding dress for a ceremony she'd never agreed to attend. His touch had claimed it, marked it, made it his. Just as he was claiming her, marking her, making her his asset to be deployed as he saw fit. She could feel his patience wearing thin, could sense his amusement at her paralysis. This was entertainment for him, watching her realize the true scope of her entrapment. He had helped her breathe, and in exchange, he had taken her freedom. The metaphorical cage he'd constructed was indeed smaller now, its bars invisible but absolute. The zipper might be functional, but she understood with crystalline clarity that she would not be leaving this party the same person who had entered it. "Time's up," Daryl whispered, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. "What's it going to be, Felicia?" The loosened fabric gave Felicia the mobility she needed. In one fluid motion, she spun away from Daryl's possessive grip, the white gown flaring around her like wings as she broke free from his carefully constructed trap. For a heartbeat, she felt the intoxicating rush of escape, her heels clicking against the marble as she plunged toward the safety of the crowded ballroom. But Daryl moved like liquid mercury, his reflexes honed by years of anticipating desperate moves from cornered prey. His fingers closed around her wrist with the precision of a steel trap, not harsh enough to bruise but firm enough to stop her momentum completely. The contact sent electricity shooting up her arm, a reminder of his casual mastery over her situation. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough volume for nearby guests to hear. "The evening is just beginning." Before she could protest, before she could even process what was happening, he was drawing her toward the center of the ballroom where couples swayed to the orchestra's languid melody. His movement was so smooth, so natural, that to observers it appeared as though he was simply claiming a dance rather than capturing escaped prey. The music wrapped around them as Daryl's arm slid around her waist, positioning them in a traditional waltz hold that felt anything but traditional. His hand on her back found the exact spot where he'd worked the zipper, a reminder of her recent vulnerability. The intimate contact they'd shared at the pillar was now on full display, transformed into what appeared to be romantic choreography. "Smile," he murmured against her temple, his lips barely moving. "Everyone is watching." And they were. The entire ballroom seemed to have turned its attention to their slow, predatory dance. Felicia could feel the weight of their collective gaze, could see the speculation in their eyes as they witnessed Daryl Graham claiming his newest acquisition on the dance floor. He led with absolute authority, guiding her movements with subtle pressure that brooked no resistance. Each step was calculated to demonstrate his control, each turn designed to show the room that she belonged to him now. The dance became a public declaration of ownership, witnessed by the city's most influential people. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" he whispered as he spun her, the motion making her dress flutter around her legs. "To be close to power, to understand how it really works?" Felicia's attempt at escape had only deepened her entrapment. What should have been her moment of freedom had become his most devastating display of dominance yet. She was trapped in plain sight, held captive by social convention and the hypnotic rhythm of the waltz. The orchestra played on, oblivious to the fact that they were providing the soundtrack to her complete and utter surrender. In Daryl's arms, surrounded by witnesses to her defeat, Felicia realized that running had only made her capture more public, more complete. more final. The orchestra's melody swelled around them, violins weaving through the air like silk scarves as Daryl drew Felicia closer. What had begun as a traditional waltz hold transformed into something far more intimate, far more possessive. His hand pressed against the small of her back where the zipper had been freed, a constant reminder of her debt to him, of the moment her independence had been traded for the simple ability to breathe. Other couples drifted around them like planets in orbit, but none dared come too close. The space around Daryl and Felicia had become sacred territory, marked by an invisible boundary that the other dancers instinctively respected. Or perhaps feared. The distinction seemed academic when the result was the same, perfect isolation in the middle of a crowded ballroom. "You move beautifully," Daryl murmured, his lips close enough to her ear that his words felt like physical contact. "Though I suspect you're still thinking about running." Felicia's response caught in her throat. The loosened dress allowed her to breathe fully for the first time all evening, but each breath felt borrowed, conditional, dependent on his continued goodwill. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. "The thought had crossed my mind," she managed, trying to inject some steel into her voice despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. His laughter was warm, genuine, which somehow made it more frightening than any threat could have been. "Of course it did. That's what makes this so delicious. You still think you have choices." The waltz turned them slowly, giving Felicia glimpses of the crowd watching their performance. She caught sight of the woman in pearls, her face a mask of fascinated horror. The men in navy suits had positioned themselves at strategic points around the dance floor, their attention focused with professional intensity. Even the servers had slowed their movements, finding excuses to linger and witness this public claiming. "They're all watching," she whispered, the observation escaping before she could stop it. "Good." Daryl's hand on her waist tightened fractionally, not enough to hurt but enough to emphasize his control. "Let them see. Let them understand exactly what happens when someone tries to dig too deeply into my business." The implication hit her like cold water. This wasn't just about her investigation or her source. This was a message, broadcast to every journalist, every law enforcement officer, every ambitious prosecutor who might be watching. This was what happened when you crossed Daryl Graham. You didn't disappear mysteriously, you didn't have an accident. You became his, publicly and completely. "You're making an example of me," she said, the words barely audible above the music. "I'm making you useful," he corrected, spinning her with practiced ease. The movement sent her dress swirling around her legs, the white fabric catching the ballroom's golden light like captured starlight. "There's a difference. Examples are disposable. Useful assets, well, they're treasured." The word treasured carried implications that made her stomach clench. She was beginning to understand that her investigation had been doomed from the start, that Daryl had been aware of her work long before tonight. This entire evening had been orchestrated, from the invitation to the malfunctioning zipper to his perfectly timed arrival. Even her dress might have been sabotaged, she realized with growing horror. "How long have you known?" The question slipped out despite her better judgment. "About your investigation? Or about you?" His smile was predatory, satisfied. "Because the answers are different, and both are enlightening." The orchestra began to wind down their piece, the melody growing softer, more intimate. Other couples started to separate, but Daryl's hold on her remained firm. He wasn't finished with this dance, wasn't ready to release her back into the crowd where she might harbor illusions of escape. "The zipper was never really broken, was it?" she asked, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. "Oh, it was broken," he assured her, his voice carrying genuine amusement. "But not by accident. Amazing what a little strategic pressure can accomplish. A tiny snag in exactly the right place, a mechanism designed to fail under stress. You'd be surprised how many problems can be solved with the right engineering." Felicia felt the walls of her reality shifting, reforming around this new understanding. Nothing tonight had been coincidental. Her beautiful dress, her mounting claustrophobia, even her desperate need for his help, all of it carefully orchestrated by a man who understood that the most effective traps were the ones people walked into willingly. As the music reached its final notes, Daryl pulled her impossibly close, their bodies pressed together in a way that would fuel gossip and speculation for months. His mouth found her ear again, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute finality. "The zipper's loose, Felicia," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. "But now you belong to me. Don't try to pull away." The orchestra's last note hung in the air like a held breath before dissolving into applause from the watching crowd. But Felicia barely heard it. She was breathing easier now, the constricting fabric no longer cutting into her ribs, no longer limiting her oxygen. Her lungs filled completely with each inhale, her body finally free from the physical trap that had tormented her all evening. Yet she had never felt more trapped in her life. The web Daryl had woven around her was complete, intricate, and utterly inescapable. She stood in the center of his carefully constructed maze, breathing freely but belonging entirely to the spider who had caught her. The price of air had been her freedom, and she was only now beginning to understand the true cost of the transaction.